Alright, 15 seconds have passed. I can now show in-game violence to a reasonable degree. YouTube is fun, isn't it? There are many things I like about the God of War series, too many to go over in a succinct fashion. People often discuss the visceral action, the story, the tone, in that some people think it's the ultimate power fantasy, and to others it's the most goofy display of self-indulgence in the world. Some even discuss how it's a series that, despite its violence, has a lot of hidden depth and complexity, particularly to that of the main character. Hey look, it's me. I think one of the things that often gets overlooked when it comes to discussing the quality of these games is actually the level design. This is something that makes these games so memorable to me, and one of the things that many games that rip off God of War tend to overlook. When it comes to the discussions of level design in games, people often only relegate it to one of two different binary blanket descriptions: linear or sandbox. Those are the two classifications, but I think on a more nuanced level, there are several shades of gray in between. When I first played God of War, most of my gaming experience up to that point was on the NES or PlayStation 1, and one thing you rarely got on those systems were coherent worlds. A lot of the time you ended up with a level select screen if you were lucky. Many games had a system wherein it was one single environment after the other with no way to return to the previous one, with naught but hard cuts between them. Obviously, those systems didn't have the memory to have game worlds render seamlessly in most cases. You could only really make games operate a few certain ways. But then around the early 6th generation, you had the rise of the 3D sandbox game, which for all their freedom and lack of load screens, were more or less by their very nature loose and open as far as level design is concerned. So at this point, it was basically one or the other. Deliberate but artificial, or open but loose. But one of my favorite things about the God of War games, and in particular the first game, is the idea that they kind of combined these two philosophies, making a seamless, interconnected world that feels open and organic, but it isn't. It still has tight linear design. One that feels like a single continuous environment that you're making your way through. Now, with that said, there definitely are individually sectioned off levels that come after cutscenes, so as far as player immersion, there are a few instances of jarring shifts in the environment. Most notably when Kratos climbs on Kronos to get to the Temple of Pandora, or when Kratos just straight up dies and goes to Hades. I'd say that's less of a push and pull of level design and more of just a requirement of the story they were telling. As a matter of fact, I feel like the intro to the first game doesn't feel like the beginning of the adventure and just feels like a standard level 1. But it gets a pass on that front because aside from framing itself as Kratos making his way to where his actual mission is, it also functions perfectly as a standalone level in sort of a bubble that acts as a tutorial before you get to the actual story. However, it didn't strike me at the time when I first played it, but once you get into Athens, it seems like this game really makes an effort to not cut away from Kratos or contrive a means to do any sort of jarring level transitions, at least to the extent it can. The lay of the land is still very much dictated by the standard pacing of a video game, but it feels like you're moving your way through the world and story in a plausibly organic fashion. But because the game's not letting you off the leash, it finds that ever-elusive middle ground where it's a linear game, but manages to have the benefits of coherent, seamless world design that only comes with sandbox games usually. What makes this feel like a living, breathing environment despite being so linear is how it's laid out like a real place, with interconnected roads and buildings. It's brilliant how the environments sprawl out but eventually fold back into themselves. You'll find yourself going through combat scenarios and many level chunks all to end up right back where you were in order to progress to the next point in the story, and the pacing kind of relies on you gradually opening up the various environments through the various abilities you can earn. It's like a Metroidvania but still linear. That way you're able to create this living, breathing, surprisingly organic feeling environment that opens up in a very natural feeling way. Open, but deliberate. Something you don't often get. It's very elegantly designed. That's kind of the word here that sticks out to me more than any when I think about how this game is designed. Elegant. It creates an intimately memorable series of environments while also allowing them to be epic in scope. I think the absolute best example of the level design in the original God of War, and where all of this design philosophy comes together perfectly, is Pandora's Temple. And I know this is going to be a controversial opinion, because Pandora's Temple is a very divisive part of the game, because it goes on for a while, and so to some people it's just a tedious padding ritual that doesn't justify its own length. But to me, it's the part of the game that I think sells the experience possibly more than any. It's an epic environment, and you find yourself sprawling out from place to place, going around the various chunks, going in and out of the temple, and so on. But every time you finish one of these chunks, it always takes you back to the relative safety of this ever-changing central hub. In some cases, in ways you wouldn't expect. And every time, the grand overarching puzzle starts to come together piece by piece, which makes it extremely rewarding when you do see it all come together in the end, like a jigsaw puzzle you didn't even know was a jigsaw puzzle at first. You really get the sense for how important it is that the box be nearly impossible to retrieve, and how much the architect sacrificed in order to make this temple as a tribute to the gods when you find his skeleton as well as the skeletons of his 2 sons. There's no doubt in my mind that it walks a line of sorts. It walks a thin line between intricate and repetitive, which is a conversation I've had many times. People will have told me that they didn't like God of War for that very reason. That it was in their minds repetitive and padded, and while they're well within their rights to think that, to me this is the most memorable and elegantly designed part of the game that has several memorable and elegantly designed parts. It all goes to give this game a feeling of a continuous, singular adventure, an odyssey if you will, which is fitting considering this game is set in ancient Greece. It helps that there are very few deliberate loading screens, so it helps to make this game feel much more continuous than it might have otherwise, which accounts for so much more than one might think. The word epic is thrown around a lot these days, but between the continuousness, the scope of the environments that you really didn't see all that much around this time, and the elegance of design, I truly believe that this game is the barest definition of the word epic. It just feels special to go through this world. Now, of course, I believe that Pandora's Temple is the apex of this particular design philosophy, which may or may not be a controversial statement, but I also think that Athens is a prime example of this design philosophy as well. The way it sprawls out and retracts, the way the design is linear while also feeling real. But it was while going through the Athens level that this design philosophy actually took on greater meaning for me. I realized that the level design is much more than simply elegant. Allow me to pull a patented Simpsons-style second act pivot. Because at this point you're probably reading the video's title and wondering how the hell any of this ties into an important character you never knew about. To me, what it comes down to is thus: I believe the world of God of War is itself an unsung character in its own right. Stick with me here. Something often ignored or overlooked in gaming is the possibility that more than any other storytelling medium, the world in itself has the potential to be a character and a major part of the story. In movies, using the world to tell the story is something you have to put deliberate thought into because it's a passive experience. You're not actively interacting with the world itself, whereas in games, the environment is the thing you're going to be interacting with more than any other character, so you're able to use that to your advantage. You can progress and express the story in interesting ways without ever having a character say a word. I've heard the Dark Souls games are very good for this, but I do know enough about Dark Souls to know that those games have a more sprawling, open-ended element to them, and the environmental storytelling is something that's pieced together through implications. But something like this isn't very often attempted in a linear game. When you don't put much thought into it, a linear game's environment can come across as a means to an end as opposed to anything deliberately designed to tell the player anything or bring anything across. And the same goes for a sandbox game, where in the lesser sandbox games, the world might have just been something they put together as a means to create gameplay and nothing else. But God of War makes important use of the environment as possibly the most important character. The levels sprawl out and fold back into each other, meaning you're constantly backtracking through the same areas. Which could easily be the developers being lazy, but it actually enhances the game because every time you go back to them, the levels and environment changes in accordance to whatever's going on in the story. Sometimes they even do this without you ever needing to backtrack through the environments. Sometimes the environments are changing right before your eyes. They use an instance where they intend for a linear progression, but instead of having only one way forward, they'll collapse a wall in front of you in real time in order to cut off one of the ways forward. This moment right here is such a small thing, but it's the type of thing that almost subliminally implants messaging in your mind of how dangerous this whole thing is. Realistically, the main thrust of the story in Athens is that Ares has gone insane, so decided to attack Athens with his armies. That's the ultra-simple summary. So by being able to show the progression of the destruction and the conquest therein in real time as you go through these areas a few times, it gives you an organic showcasing of his power, the destruction he's caused, and gives the plot a ticking clock element for how long you have before Athens is destroyed, giving the backtracking a purpose, and it's all done without ever having to say a word. It's a very important thing in a game like this where the main character spends 90% of the game by himself and as such doesn't have anyone to bounce off of. Therefore, the game has no real way to deliver exposition moment to moment verbally. When there's no way for characters to organically progress the story, you need to make the world tell the story, and that's where simple means to an end takes on greater meaning, and the environment being a character in itself also comes across in the various landmarks you can come across as you go. As you're progressing, you'll notice a number of specific things that stand out. Something might not instantly draw your eye, but there's a definite attempt to have a series of things that may or may not stick out to you. And invariably, whenever this happens, they always come back to it later on. If you move off the beaten path to search for upgrades, you'll find the edge of this cliff where the game's intro and outro takes place. I won't elaborate because discussing that scene invariably gets me demonetized. If you see this random medallion-looking thing on the ground, it might come across as a random bit of over-designed architecture, but suddenly you find it as the entrance point to a staircase by which the game proceeds a very significant chunk of time later. You think you're finished with this level forever, but no, they have you do a full lap and end up right back at the beginning as sort of a restart. You'll cross a bridge that you think looks like a giant sword, only to find out that it is a giant sword that you use later on to fight Ares. It gives the world a sense of coherent wholeness that you don't ever notice until it's all said and done. Once again, using the understanding that you're going to be seeing these landmarks multiple times, and using that to showcase a level of environmental foreshadowing. It's not bad for a video game to feel artificial and video gamey in its design, but being immersed in a world starts with the world feeling real. And none of that would have been possible had it not been for the actual functional design of the environments. If they just had you travel from place to place with loading screens in between. In fairness, not every chunk of the game is as good as some of the parts I've mentioned. Of course, there's the aforementioned first level on the Aegean Sea, which like I said I give a pass to based on context, and then there's the Hades level, which is by far the most jarring shift as far as breaking up the levels. And the level itself is definitely the most video gamey level in the game. I think most people will agree that this is the universal lowlight of God of War 2005. The design is boring, and there's a lot of needless frustration, particularly with these two separate walls you have to climb. But even this level has a way of recontextualizing what's come before, resetting you all the way back to the beginning of the game with something that most players probably wouldn't even pay any mind to at the beginning. The hole that the gravedigger dug, leading you straight back to Athens, where you get to see the culmination of the environmental storytelling. You see the aftermath of Ares' conquest with the entirety of Athens in ruin and Ares standing victorious. So even though the Hades level is a jarring shift, it manages to connect itself back to the rest of the world at large. I feel like the level design in God of War 2005 is what carries the experience for me. It's the thing that I point to when discussing what the first game does better than the others. The later games may technically play better, but I find myself still enjoying the hell out of this one because of the intangible elements not found in the other games. I think as far as having these intricacies of level design, God of War 3 does a pretty good job at this as well, almost as well as God of War 1, because right from the beginning it foreshadows a lot of things happening in the game by having you briefly visit a lot of environments that will play into the game later on, and foreshadows the fact that you will return to them by having obvious visual landmarks that you can't interact with, such as Gaia's heart being surrounded by crystal that you don't have a means to interact with, for example, or background details that you would probably take for granted, such as the giant chains of balance that serve as a means to connect different parts of the world multiple times, or the three judges of the dead in the underworld whom you run into too many times for them not to be a Chekhov's gun. And they do a good job at visual storytelling in that as the game goes on, you get to see piece by piece all the different ways that each slain god has caused the world further destruction. After a while, you'll even find random Johnnies strewn throughout the various levels who have all come down with a mysterious plague that was a result of Hermes dying. I feel like God of War 3 gets close to what the first game did with its level design, and the environment is definitely one of the most important characters in the game, if not the most, but it does fall a bit short, mostly because the progression is slightly more video gamey, with portals and Space Harrier minigames taking place as a means for you to travel between the locations, so there are more jarring shifts, and the overall game world doesn't feel quite as cohesive. It doesn't feel like the environments are folding into each other, leaving the level design feeling a little bit less elegant. And because you find yourself in areas that aren't affected by the death of the gods in a more grand scope, there aren't as many opportunities for the environment to tell the story. But I'm no less impressed with how they managed to use these various locations in the game to tie into the final sequence with Pandora's box. It really felt like a payoff to the entire game in that it felt like everything was foreshadowing this one event. If nothing else, it gives the game a sense of cohesion that maybe wasn't there before, but I think in this regard, God of War 2 feels the most video gamey out of all of them, because you're bouncing from environment to environment, none of which really have much deliberate connectivity between each other. You get on a Pegasus and find yourself flying from Rhodes to Mount Etna, then you fanny about there for a while before making your way to the Island of Creation. You don't revisit too many places. More to the point, there's no major overarching point that the world can communicate to the player because realistically, many of these locations exist pragmatically as the next stop on Kratos' road to revenge. There's also no sense of urgency because realistically, you can take as long as you want here. This is by no means something I hold against God of War 2, because structurally it's going for something entirely different to God of War 1, and I wouldn't dream of trying to criticize a game for something that it's not trying to be. Besides, it's something that enhances the experience when it's there, like sprinkles on top of a cake. It adds a bit of flavor, but the cake is still by no means incomplete without it, and the cake is still delicious. Still, as far as elegance of design, cohesion, and environmental storytelling, God of War 3 is great, but nothing beats God of War 1. Some people will tell you that God of War 1 is repetitive, overlong, doesn't make the most out of its design, and so on, but to me, it's something that rides a fine line but comes out on top as one of the more well-designed and memorable games I've played. In my opinion, at least. Although God of War 3 is still my favorite in the series. Man, it's good to talk about God of War again. It's been a minute, and you can expect more in the near future, assuming I don't get screwed like last time. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content like these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to users Brooklyn, Bettch, Gaw004, Joseph Rosas, Nicholas Pino, FarmCat84, and Raaf for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, you can support the channel by liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!